to JSA TV, your virtual newsroom for telecom professionals. Joining us here today, we're honored to have Mr. Michael Elling. He is the Principal of Information Velocity Partners. Michael, welcome to JSA TV.
Good afternoon, Jamie.
Now, I know your company's been really gathering some phenomenal information on a topic near and dear to my heart. America's deficit is broadband deficit. So could you tell us, for our viewers who may not already know, how do you define America's broadband deficit?
Sure, Jamie. I've actually covered the sector for 23 years, so for a better part of since it's been competitive in 1983. And I define America's bandwidth deficit as the difference between what consumers are getting today in terms of coverage, speed, and performance versus really what they should be getting with the current technology. And I think that differential is as high as between 20 and 150 times, depending on who one is as a consumer today. And the trend lines from the 1980s to today in terms of both supply and demand, which have shown exponential change, are evidenced by examples from Google Fiber in Kansas City versus, say, Time Warner rates in New York City for broadband. And the same holds, by the way, for Wi-Fi cost relative to the 4G mobile networks we're all on today. This deficit, this difference in real price versus actual cost is holding back our economy and society. We should be on things like low-cost telework, telemedicine, teleeducation, and it should be possible everywhere today. There's no reason 100% of the population and businesses don't have high-definition two-way video services to affordable, high-definition screens and mobile devices. And the U.S. in particular, if you think about it, given its large land mass and dispersed population centers, must lead in these areas. I don't think we should compare ourselves to Asia or Europe. Really, that's like comparing two monarchies when we're debating democracy. We had the lead 15 years ago, and there's no reason why we shouldn't have an equal or better lead today.
So how did we get to this situation? What do you see as the top reasons for our deficit?
Yeah, we had very competitive communication markets in the 80s and 90s, but then consolidated them and remonopolized them in the last 10 to 15 years, so during the 2000s. And to really understand that, you can look at it two ways. How did we get to this point? One is from an economic and business model perspective, and the other is from a policy and historical perspective. First, if you look at today's legacy networks and content service providers, they developed out of government-supported monopolies that started about 100 years ago. And we look at it economically, both from supply and demand. With respect to supply, it's not just the tremendous change in processing speed and technology, what most people have come to accept as Moore's law, but the complete capital and operating costs for wide area coverage, high capacity, and great clarity or quality of service. We refer to these four key factors of supply as the 4 C's of supply. And they're simply not where they need to be today. And that's because the service providers are vertically integrated, and they're not able to achieve necessary scale economies required to generate a return on investment based on what are arguably artificial geographic or market segmentation and boundaries. In other words, they're not positioned to serve demand which is no longer in a silo. Today's end users are highly mobile, and they require two-way high-definition voice, data, and video everywhere, on large screens, on their mobile phones, on their tablets. And at the same time, the lines between commercial users and residential segments have all but disappeared, so upending the traditional revenue models of these businesses. Geographic distinctions really are not based on, which were based on population or density and were politically driven by geographic boundaries, they're disappearing as well. For instance, we're building fiber optic lines into rural markets to support data centers, which process more information and consume more bandwidth and power than small cities. In turn, these fiber optic net lines can be the backbones for low-cost, last-mile, universally accessible broadband demand on shared fiber wireless networks. But you know, the uptake will only come if these services are easy to use, meaning user interface are simple and the services can be used across a wide array of contexts, appealing to everyone. What I call the 4 U's of demand, user interface, usability, ubiquity, and universality, really determine how quickly network effects occur. And network effects are also known as Metcalfe's law. When we take all 8 of these supply and demand factors together, we see that the service provider model is broken and unsustainable. In fact, bandwidth pricing disconnected from Moore's and Metcalfe's laws about 10 years ago, resulting from several government policy missteps beginning with the Telecom Act of 1996. And that really brings us to the second reason America's bandwidth deficit exists, which involves looking more at the role government has played historically controlling information networks. No one argues with the rapid changes in communications and computers over the past 30 years. Take practically every 25 to 30-year forecast in 1980, and very few, if any, would have even come close to describing or modeling what actually happened to our society and our economy. The problem is that we need to step back and understand exactly what happened and why so many experts debating the issue, like those involved in a recent FCC Open Internet paper that came out last week, are myopically debating where we go from here. Simply put, most people don't see or understand that the past 30 years have been a small part of a 175-year digital information revolution that is only just beginning. And the fact that what is happening today has really happened in the past. For example, the first 70 years of that revolution, starting in the late 1830s, were truly generative, and perhaps more so than in the 1980s and 1990s, both absolute and relative terms, simply because back in the late 1800s, people lacked modern-day amenities and conveniences brought about by mechanized transport and electricity. All of those things that were thought about and built while people were on horses and using kerosene lamps and candles for the most part to work at night. We have also forgotten that all these great inventions, the telegraph, the telephone, pictures, audio, recording and playback, and also full motion video, came about because of openly competitive markets in which standards were developed by entrepreneurs and mostly private investment, supported occasionally by public funds. But you know, in 1913, exactly 100 years ago, we put this modern digital information revolution on hold by implementing artificial monopoly barriers and constraints across numerous networks and technologies for the better part of 70 years. And then in 1983, we separated Ma Bell into the Baby Bells and the core AT&T. So the 1980s and 90s were about learning to do the competitive walk again. That competitive walk gave us advanced digital and free voice networks, gave us the internet, and it gave us low-cost wireless networks. In fact, we can use the lessons learned from all 3 of those revolutions, or little revolutions, to model the future. The digitization of the last mile, what we're talking about today, is no different from the digitization of wireless we saw in 1996. And with that, we saw an immediate 90% drop in marginal costs and pricing to reflect that. And that's what we're seeing, by the way, in Kansas City.
And that's a great segue. How do we rectify this situation moving forward? How do we provide broadband access to America's children in an effective, competitive way moving forward?
Yeah. You know, the problem is the only real competitive threat to the communication monopolies comes from internet players like Google or Apple or Microsoft. There are a few small nascent efforts, but if you were to draw a parallel between the current state of competition and that famous saga Star Wars. The difference between the competitive forces of the 1990s and the Rebel Alliance in the movie is that Luke missed the shot. And in our case, the Death Star rounded the planet and pulverized the Rebel Alliance. And unfortunately, today's competitive forces are like lumps of plasma floating in space and trying to coalesce into sustainable business models. What the industry needs are visionaries like Bill McGowan, who broke up AT&T, or Craig McCaw, who first started down the road to national wireless networks, working against government policy, or Lou Gerstner, who reoriented the IBM monolith with the threat of the distributed data processing model from Microsoft and Intel, the Wintel model, or maybe someone like Jeff Bezos, who's redefining the retail business on the internet. If this doesn't happen, the monopolies will only continue to underperform as investors wake up to the numerous flaws in their business models. And in the process, will continue to negatively impact the economy. And as you said, our children won't be able to get all the advantages out of the information networks. So where do we go? Well, our prescription is to start with a goal, or the why we need to do this. It's not dissimilar to what Facebook announced last week with internet.org. Our version of internet.org is called Fast Internet Free Everywhere, or FIFE. But you say, can it really be free? And the answer is yes. If competition drives pricing to reflect marginal cost and supply and demand forces are working efficiently, both positive ROI and free access can be achieved. We demonstrated this in numerous ways in the 1980s and 1990s with 800 services, the internet and advertising, corporate VPNs, and recently with access solutions like Wi-Fi. In fact, in 1983, if someone had said to you, okay, by 2000 or 17 years from now, 90% of all what's considered long-distance communications will be free, you would have locked that person up in the funny farm. But the reality is that's exactly what happened. The how, as to how we're going to get there, is if stakeholders across academia, policy, trade management, and investors agree on an objective framework. The recent FCC paper that I talked about, the Open Internet Order, calls for something like this. And we happen to develop a framework called the InfoStack that captures and models the supply and demand issues I mentioned earlier consistently so that every layer and every boundary point can be properly labeled and scaled by market forces. It should be noted that FCC Internet paper is mostly about definition and positioning and not really about policy prescriptives. So what needs to be done? We need to implement a policy in the lower layers which fosters open or equal access. All those three digital processes or waves of the 1980s and 1990s I referred to earlier, voice, data, wireless, started with open or equal access. Service providers need to understand that the current level of operating and capital costs are not sustainable unless they share those facilities with other players. In the middle layers, we need settlement exchanges and models that foster new service introduction rapidly across disparate networks and from the upper and down to the lower layers. Finally, I think we've all seen robust competition in the operating system and application ecosystems in both the internet and wireless models to know that competitive market forces are capable of untapping and serving nearly infinite and constantly changing demand.
Well said, and for sure it's tapping on a lot of heartstrings of our viewers out there. There needs to be policy, there needs to be infrastructure, there needs to be a really valid conversation where we get together and create our own policy by the people who are doing it, who know it, who live it. So for those of us out there who are interested, how can they get in touch with you?
Well, I have a website. It's called www.ivpcapital.com. I write a regular blog. I also describe really what's gone on historically, and I also describe the framework that I just mentioned, the InfoStack, and how we can both quantify and qualify information and really, establish an objective, neutral dialogue, because really it's in the best interest of both sides, the monopoly and the pro-competitive forces, to understand these issues and work together.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, viewers, for tuning in to JSA TV.